Our final speaker for this evening is Catriona Nicholls. There she is on screen. Catriona is 48 and has a 26-year-old son, two lovely granddaughters, aged 5.5 and 19 months old. She's just completed her Master's in Equality Studies this year, and she's currently doing a professional postgraduate diploma in Neurodiversity in UCD. She sits on UCD's Neurodiversity Working Group and is very passionate about neurodiversity and advocacy, being neurodivergent herself and coming from a neurodivergent family. Catriona is here to speak to us about her lived experience. So I'll pass over to Catriona. And Catriona, you let me know if you want some questions.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm very nervous, so I hope this flows. What I wanted to discuss was the connection between trauma and neurodiversity and how that adds an extra layer of complexity to the lives of people who are neurodiverse. I grew up in a family with 6 children, and looking back now, my dad was definitely neurodivergent and struggled to regulate his emotions. So the home was quite dysfunctional and chaotic. And on top of that, then when my dad had experienced childhood trauma himself, and when he drank, unfortunately, he was violent to my mother. So we grew up then being traumatized by his behavior, and trauma tends to be passed from one generation to the next unless somebody recognizes the pattern and decides to change it. I was fortunate enough at 42 or maybe a little bit earlier to kind of recognize the pattern, because my son was starting to display similar behaviors to me and was very angry with me, understandably, because I had addiction issues trying to deal with my trauma. And basically my addiction was stopping me, dealing with my trauma. I didn't really understand what was wrong with me. And I came to that realization heading to my 40s that trauma was what was wrong with me, and that I was possibly neurodiverse. But my eldest 2 brothers are twins, but one brother in particular, and I look at him and myself, because we probably would have displayed the most dysfunctional behavior as maybe being the most sensitive children in the family. He started drinking in his 20s and ended up being violent to every partner he was with. And he went on to be with one partner who herself was very dysfunctional. Both of them would have been toxic individually, but together they were just ultra toxic. And they had 3 children. And my nephew, Blaine, was diagnosed with ADHD as a child because he had a lot of behavior problems. So he grew up in a very dysfunctional and chaotic home, and started smoking weed at about 13, 14. That led him into all sorts of problems, owing people money, selling drugs, people coming to the house threatening to kick the door in because he owed money. And it was obvious looking back now that the kid was really struggling. But on the 17th of March 2017, actually 10 days after my first granddaughter was born, I got the phone call that my nephew had taken his own life. So, that really, really put things in my face. Do you know what I mean? That I needed to change. And I see him as a victim of our family's dysfunction. And I wonder, because of his ADHD, did he really intend to do it? Was it just an impulsive thing in the moment, and there was just no coming back from it? I suppose we'll never know that, but it made me realize I'd already been on the path to changing my life and actually addressing my trauma, because I realized that unless I did, I was, nothing was going to change for my family. I now had this new granddaughter that I didn't want her growing up in that sort of chaos and dysfunction. And I suppose at the same time, then I got my first neurodiverse diagnosis of ADHD, and that sort of helped me as well be able to understand myself more, and actually dealing with my trauma. I had the idea that my addiction was just a symptom of what was really wrong with me, and what was really wrong with me was low self-esteem and the fact that I was traumatized. And I felt like if I dealt with my trauma, the addiction would fall away, and that's exactly what happened. I mean, trauma dwells in every cell of your body. You're literally living in fight or flight mode the whole time. It's extremely stressful and then I suppose neurodiversity adds another layer onto that because you feel different. And then the shame caused by, you know, I felt immense shame coming from the family that I came from, and I knew it wasn't normal to handle difficulties or problems in the way that they were handled in my household. So, you know, the interplay of all those things is so complex. And I never attempted suicide, but I have self-harmed and I have suicidal ideation. Do you know what I mean? It's like almost a relief to be able to think about suicide when things get too much and when things get on top of you. And thankfully, like at age 42, I went to university. Like I stopped my addiction and then replaced it with something really positive in my life, along with, at the same time, dealing with my trauma with various therapists. And I'm certainly much more relaxed now. Like trauma made my neurodiversity much more pronounced and life more difficult to deal with. And like I said, my son was sort of following my trajectory. At 16, he had dropped out of school. He'd actually been asked to leave school because he wouldn't accept any discipline. Very angry with me. We had a very fraught relationship at that time. And in the short space of time, in the last 5 years, I think me being able to learn how to regulate myself, because I was dealing with the things that caused me to be dysregulated, allowed me to be calmer, allowed me to set boundaries at home. And then that gave him the space to be calmer and to grow emotionally and developmentally. And I'm pleased to say, like, he's now gone into a second year in Trinity and is doing brilliantly. So I guess the moral of my story is that dealing with trauma completely turns things around. But I don't think there's been enough discourse about the relationship in Irish society between trauma and then neurodiversity. I suppose it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, like which came first, like does the neurodiversity cause the trauma because people are undiagnosed and unregulated? Like the saying goes, like DNA loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. And I know Gabor Mate has spoken a lot about the link between trauma and ADHD. So I definitely think, like, a lot of people, especially adults now, turning up to these adult ADHD services, you know, have a lot more complexity going on. But if you don't deal with the trauma, you know what I mean, the outcomes, I suppose, are a lot worse. And, you know, there is the link between ADHD and higher rates of suicide, higher rates of self-harm, and higher rates of suicidal ideation. So I think, you know, I know now with the ADAPT service that there is CBT in groups, but like that wouldn't address somebody's trauma, you know what I mean? So they need access in adult mental health services to a psychologist to do that one-on-one work if, you know, they are presenting with trauma or complex trauma. Sorry, my brain's freezing now. That's my ADHD coming into play.
Well, Catriona, I'm curious, you know, your chicken and egg scenario, do you think knowing your diagnoses has helped in the trauma processing, or do you think it was the trauma processing work that's really helped you along your journey? Like, is there one that was more powerful than the other, or do you think both were necessary?
I think definitely both were necessary for me, because aside from the trauma, I always felt different. And I knew from a very early age that I thought very differently. I was hypersensitive. And that in itself is traumatic, because the world can be a very ugly place. And I think when you're sensitive, and I think specifically for males as well, it's difficult to be sensitive in this world. But if you're sensitive and you're male, you know, society does not support that. So it's even more difficult. And I think that's why there might be more aggression and violence from males. And like, women attempt suicide more than males, but males are just more successful. So there's higher rates of women attempting it or self-harming, but males tend to carry it through. So there's higher rates for males there with suicide. So I think, yeah, dealing with the shame and the hurt and the pain. And like, you know, I look back now retrospectively, and like, my dad didn't have opportunities. There wasn't mental health services there. There wasn't any language that he could understand himself under, you know what I mean? I think later in life, he certainly calmed down a lot more and was a lot more reflective. And I know he had a lot of regrets. And it's just very sad that he didn't get that opportunity to change things. But I did, thankfully. And I still see my brother now, like, you know, at times it causes me great anger that his son taking his own life. He came home and found him. My nephew was living with him at the time. He came home from work in the morning and found him. And I'm sure that was massively traumatic, but that still hasn't spurred him into, he's still drinking. Still, that didn't spur him, that didn't shock him, which I can't understand, into, because he has 2 other children that need him. And it's too late for my nephew now. It's too late to change things for him, but he had the opportunity there to change for his other children and his grandchildren. So yeah, and I find it very difficult actually interacting with my family members now, because I've dealt with my trauma and I'm less of a dysfunctional person. I feel I'm pulled back into that dynamic with them when I interact with them. So it's difficult because I can see their neurodiversity, can see it all through my family, but they're just not acknowledging it or aren't aware. I've tried to sort of drop hints, you know what I mean? You don't want to be diagnosing people, but it is a massive lens with which to understand yourself. But definitely the trauma was more important. I think, dealing with that, because like it's cellular, you know what I mean? It's in every inch of you and it's propelling your behavior. And, you know, I was a heroin addict, I was a cocaine addict, I was an alcoholic. And then the minute I start dealing with my trauma, well, a few months in, that was all gone, because I had no need now to deal with it, you know, to use those substances to deal with my pain and my shame. You know, I didn't need to get away from myself anymore. I was able, and I suppose getting diagnosed was important too, because it gave me a new lens with which to understand myself and to have compassion for my dad and, you know, my other family members, you know.
I don't know if you're seeing this, but there's a flurry of messages coming through on the chat function with lots of what you're saying resonating with the participants. I wanted to take the opportunity, Catriona, to thank you for sharing your experience, which is so raw, so powerful, and so difficult to share. It's such a difficult topic to talk about in general. So thank you so much for coming on and being so open and so honest and so vulnerable.
You're welcome.
With us.
And the reality of it is, my nephew had a 9-month-old baby when he took his own life. So she's a 6-year-old little girl now, growing up without her daddy. Yeah. You know, her life is irrevocably changed as well, forever. And that's the reality. People who take their own lives leave behind family members, children, siblings, mothers, fathers. And to me, they're unnecessary deaths. They can be prevented, but people need to get the right help. And what helped me was amazing therapists. I had 3 female therapists who were just outstanding, really compassionate, really held me and gave me that space and trust to be vulnerable and to talk about really difficult things. And it's like therapy is reparenting. They're reparenting and giving you that love and that respect in that space. You know what I mean? And I found myself becoming very attached to all 3 of them. Particularly the first one in the HSC, because she actually fought to be able to diagnose me back in 2017, which would have been unheard of in primary care. So, you know, she really went out on a limb for me. So I'm forever grateful. But honestly, I would encourage anybody who's had stuff happen to them, whether you're in your childhood or adulthood, like, don't carry that burden, don't carry that weight, because you don't need to.